memoir.
Well, welcome everyone to the Patent Free Library. I think you all know why you're here, but just in case you need a refresher, tonight we have Melanie Brooks and Susan Conley in conversation about Melanie's book, and I assume some other things too. We can't wait to hear what they have to say. If you want to buy copies of either of their books, Terry from Mockingbird Bookshop is over there at the table. And over here on this table, we have feedback cards if you have anything you really want to say about this program afterwards. And thank you all for coming tonight.
All
It's
right.
all yours.
Thank you, Hannah. Welcome everyone. Hi, Melanie. Hi, Susan. Melanie and I worked together in graduate school. I had the great pleasure of being her professor for 2 different semesters, I believe. Yeah. And the most impactful one was I got to work on her senior creative thesis with her, and then watched her publish an extraordinary anthology first. Yeah. Called Writing Hard Stories. And I love how you riff on that with a hard silence. Yeah, we should keep, cut that out. Yeah. I want to thank the Patent Free Library. This was my hometown growing up, when I wasn't in my real hometown across the river. But this is where I did my homework every day before I went to the YMCA across the street to go to gymnastics and swim practice. Right here. So it's wild to be here. It's a really cool library, and I'm so grateful to you for doing these kinds of programs. And I want to thank Terry at Mockingbird because it's the best bookstore ever. So thank you so much. We have been talking about this book for a while.
We have.
I mean, in so many ways. So I'm just thrilled to keep the dialogue going. And I love this book, and I most admire the kind of radical honesty that I would say you arrived at with this book. Let's go back to the first time we meet. Okay. We're at the Stone House at the Stone Coast Building.
Yes. So this was I'm surprised that Susan ever wanted to work with me after this. So Susan was a visiting faculty member. I don't know, was that like
literally my first hour
audition?
I didn't think of it as that, but it was my first hour on campus ever.
And it was like my second day of my first residency. So anybody who's not done an MFA program, a low residency MFA program, you go and these intensive 10 days, and like within hours, you're just overwhelmed by all the people and all the things. And so it used to be housed in the Stone House on Wolf's Neck State Park. And it's this, drafty old mansion, but beautiful, but it had these very crammed rooms. So like picture like half of this crammed with chairs, and Susan's, I think she was talking about what, travel writing or something.
Yeah, it wasn't
like there wasn't anything like threatening about her topic. But what she did do at the beginning is, she said to this group of like 55 people, like, go around and ask, what you're all writing about. And so it just so happened that like she started over here and I was sitting like where Terry is over there, like the last person. So, she's going like, tell me about, what you're writing. People are throwing out like acronyms like my WIP, and which I didn't know that meant work in progress. I knew nothing at that stage. And I felt myself like getting more and more anxious as she was getting nearer to me. And she got to me, I opened my mouth and just started sobbing, like not just a little bit, like dramatic dissolution into what I've called like the inconvenient crying, and historically I was not somebody who cried regularly in public. And so I kind of like, I think I mumbled something like, I'm writing about my dead dad, and then proceeded to sit there
and cry
for the entire thing.
Anytime we got even near her,
and I'm like, on either side of me are these lovely women who met me like the day before. They're like trying to like find tissues and then, but it was just this moment of, I went thinking I knew exactly what I was writing about. But the moment I was kind of put on the spot and asked that question, I realized like, I have no idea. Like, I really have no idea. And the idea of even trying to figure it out felt absolutely terrifying to me. So that was our first meeting.
That was
So,
our first meeting.
It was great.
And I mean, we could only go up from there, or deeper. And I feel like that's what we've always done. We've always gone deeper, and we've always pressed on things.
Yeah.
And I'm having two thoughts. One is that I have a feeling, and this is what this book is about, this beautiful book is about a lot, is getting closer and closer to the grief, getting closer and closer to the silence and secrets, because they cost too much to keep. And you knew, even in my invitation, like, what are you writing about? You knew, you could see what was going to be called on. And the second thing is, and this is where I want to go back to you and the journey this book has taken you on, is that what I probably did, I'm pretty sure I did in that workshop seminar, was I said, so there's a thing, there's like an outer story, and I was teaching Peter Heller's book, Peter Hester's book, Oracle Bones, and it's an extraordinary road trip sojourn across China in a car. He had lived there for a long time, and he was sort of my hero for writing about China, where I had lived, but he was really writing about a lot of other things. And therein lies the rub, right, with writing. And so you thought you were writing one thing, right? But when I asked you, what are you really writing about? And so I want to turn that to you now in 2023, these 10 years later. Yeah. And say, okay, so it's called A Hard Silence. What do you most think you were investigating in this book now?
Well, I feel like I can really answer that now. And I've read stuff that you've written, and I know you talked about this to me as a student, and I've heard you talk about it to other students, about kind of like the question that sits over the writing and kind of hovers there, And I think for me, it was really like, what are the consequences of having to suffer in silence? What is the impact of that? So, the backdrop, of course, is my family's story and, my father's infection with HIV, but that was the backdrop. But the real story was, and is, what are the consequences of silence? And then how do you speak out of that silence, right? Like, how do you find a voice to speak what was once unspeakable?
Powerful. That's really powerful articulation. Will you tell us the sort of the greatest hits of the book, the headline,
sure,
for folks that don't know?
Absolutely. So the context is that in 1985, my father, who was a surgeon, had a heart attack at the age of 42, and he underwent a quadruple bypass. And 8 months after his surgery, he was informed that the blood he'd been given during open heart surgery or immediately following was contaminated. And they asked him to come and get tested, and he tested positive for HIV. And so in 1985, it was a very different culture than it is now surrounding HIV. It was a widely misunderstood disease. There was overarching stigma. We were living in a culture that widely blamed victims of this disease for their infection. And, because you had the primary groups that were being most impacted were gay men and intravenous drug users. And so, you had a whole kind of contingent of society that was, kind of placing, God's wrath over the victims of this disease. And so that was kind of the cultural context in which this happened. We were living in Canada at the time, and public health laws in Canada were stricter than they were here. And my father, was at the height of his medical career, but anticipated he'd be dead within months. And so he decided to try to keep the rest of us from experiencing any kind of ostracism. I was 13 at the time. I have 3 brothers, you know, we were all either teenagers or younger, and that we would keep this a secret, and it would be a secret we'd all keep. But my father ended up living for 10 years before his death in 1995. And so from the age of 13 until the age of 23, this was a story I carried very silently and very alone. And, you know, kind of shaping the pivotal developmental periods. So in writing the memoir, another Susan story, I worked with Susan in my second semester, and one of her first assignments she asked me to do was to create a timeline. And, you know, it seems like that would be a simple task. And I think she thought, like, that's a straightforward, easy, like, first thing for
She
you
won't
to do.
cry.
And I started on this timeline, and I just realized, like, this story is so much bigger than this, like, line here. And I kind of made it through like 2 notches on the line. And then I called Susan and I was like, could we meet? and, you know, we had this really long conversation. I remember it was at the museum, the art museum in Portland. And we had this really long conversation. And I just said, there's just so much that's like outside of the linear story. And so that kind of became, you call it kind of the narrative conceit, right? Like this idea that it's more than just this linear timeline. And so much of the story kind of went back and forth through time. And so that's eventually how I ended up structuring it, that it doesn't read in a linear fashion. And one of the other things was that I was in therapy. I started therapy at the same time as I started writing this, fortuitously. And
Thank God.
I know, it's seriously, like, I recommend it to anybody. If you're going to start writing, find a good therapist, you know. But that journey in therapy of processing, you know, things I had never talked about before, and then trying to bring those things to the page felt very much a part of the story. And so, you know, my time in therapy is also a thread that weaves in, and that kind of became the one thing that could be linear. Like, I could see the progression of what was changing in me kind of through this therapeutic process. So I included that as well.
You know, I remember being so glad that you were in therapy, because
You didn't have to deal with all my crying.
because I knew what was coming for her. And let me just say that when I suggested the chronology, I thought of it as handholds for her in her climb. I didn't necessarily think she would hook the book to it, right, and use it in that sense. And I believe chronologies then want to be blown up. But I did think at some point she might want to get and she was not ready to get the things down.
No,
like, we were not going to do that. Why don't we read a little bit,
sure,
so people get to hear your great voice?
Okay.
And let's go to the sort of page 95 world. And let's just start like at the second paragraph of page 96.
Okay.
Therapy.
Right. So I'm in therapy, and I have just spent like the first part of this scene sitting in the waiting room redesigning my therapist's waiting room, because I think it's a terrible design. So yeah, okay. So I said, one of these days I was going to tell Dr. B my waiting room beautification plan. Not today, though. Today I didn't know what I was going to tell him, or whether I could tell him anything at all. His mother had died the week before. That day was his first day back in the office. When we'd last met 3 weeks earlier, I told Dr. B that even though I'd known for 10 years that my father was going to die, nothing had prepared me for what it would feel like to lose him. Dad was the mooring to which I'd attached since I was a little girl. Without him, I felt untethered. No matter how much time passed, I couldn't shed that feeling. I miss him all the time, I said. He should be here. The lament tumbled from my lips, and the force of my grief hit me hard. I covered my face with my hands while sobs shook my shoulders. Dr. B knew the moments that weren't meant for words. For what felt like a long time, my sobs were the only sound. I'd cried plenty of times in his office, pretty much every time, but not like this. This crying was raw, every nerve ending exposed, my insides spread wide open for view. Eventually, I reached for a tissue from the box on the table and wiped my eyes and nose. I looked at him then, poised to apologize for falling apart. He spoke first, though, and his voice was accepting and gentle. Tell me what you miss about your dad. It was the first time anyone had invited me, carte blanche, to talk about my dad on my terms. And just like on my first visit to Dr. B, I felt like he wanted to know that there was safety in his presence to feel what I needed to feel. So I started scattered memories, mingling with my imaginings, what life now would be like with Dad in it. This is what you need, Dr. B said, tilting his head to the side, his eyes thoughtful. Probably what you've needed for a really long time. You need space to talk about your dad, what you loved, what you lost, what you grieve, what you miss. I nodded. So we'll keep doing it, he promised, wrapping up our session, as long as you need to. A swell of gratitude rose in me. He wasn't recoiling from my stories or from my sadness. He was sitting right in it and offering to come closer. I walked out the door feeling different, lighter. But that was 3 distant weeks ago, before he called to let me know he was traveling out of state because his mother was ill and we needed to cancel our next appointment. Before I got a second call from his office manager a few days later to cancel 2 more appointments because Dr. B's mother had died and he was staying at the family home to get everything in order. How the hell was I supposed to walk into that office today and continue talking about my grief when his was so fresh? My fingers grazed the edge of the white envelope tucked inside the pocket of my handbag. Rather than a hallmarky pre-printed sympathy card, I'd chosen a simple blank one, a photo of a lush green forest on its front. Dr. B, I knew, was a nature guy. I didn't try to find my own words for what felt wordless, and instead I copied lines from a favorite Wendell Berry poem, The Piece of Wild Things Inside. The time I spent agonizing over whether I should give him this card was beyond ridiculous. I wanted to be respectful and appropriate, but the lines of this relationship felt newly hazy to me. He's not your friend, he's your therapist, I reminded myself. But the previous week, when I'd gotten the call from the office manager, the sadness that blanketed me at the news of his loss felt a lot like what I'd feel for any one of my close friends in the same circumstance. My body tensed at the sounds of Dr. B's office door opening and his footsteps padding down the short hallway to the waiting room. He poked his head around the corner, gave me his normal smile, and said, "Come on back, Melanie." I followed him to his office and tried to keep my breathing even, tried not to cry. It was too early in the session for the crying. I handed him my check as usual, and he sat at his desk to write out my receipt. I positioned myself on the center cushion of the leather couch, and while I waited for him to take his seat across from me, I soothed my palm on my thighs in a repetitive pattern. I'd forgotten my cup of tea, and my hands had nothing to do. Dr. B settled into his chair. I noticed the dull shadows that ringed his eyes, and though he was his pleasant self, I sensed he was weary. "So," he said, the standard opening for me to share what was on my mind. He wove his fingers together across his bent knee. There were things I was supposed to say. "I'm so sorry about your mom," I managed haltingly, and my voice cracked at the end. The words felt artificial and cliche. "Thank you," he said. "Are you okay?" I didn't know if I was allowed to ask this. We only talked about his personal life if he brought it up in the context of our conversation, but I couldn't help it. I wanted to know. "I'm okay." His voice remained steady, but there was something in the way he said it that hinted at the sorrow of the past few days. So many other questions sifted through my mind. I wanted to ask about the rest of his family, his siblings, his wife, his 2 young boys. How were they? Were they okay? I recognized that these weren't my questions to ask. The understood boundaries between us told me that these weren't my answers to know. "How are you?" He was redirecting. I looked down at my hands and fiddled with my wedding band, twisting it one way and retwisting it the other. I felt displaced, separated from the usual safety of this space. 3 weeks ago, I'd felt so at ease that I expressed myself more honestly, exposed my grief more fully than I ever had before. That ease had vanished. In its place, a giant roadblock of uncertainty detoured my words, made me second guess what I should and should not say. And to top things off, I was crying. Can you talk to me about what you're feeling? Dr. B asked. No, I thought, I can't. That was the whole point. I was surprised at the flash of anger that tied onto these thoughts. I don't know how to do this. I choked and swiped in frustration at my tears. How to do what? This, I gestured at him, at myself, at the space between us. How can I talk to you about my sadness, my pain? It's so selfish. My voice got smaller. Your mother just died. I wondered if this might happen, he said, and scratched at his beard. You feel like you should be taking care of me, right? I bit my lip, dropped my eyes, and nodded. Why shouldn't I? Despite a rational piece of me that knew the partnership, knew the parameters of this therapist-client relationship, an emotional piece of me needed the illusion of him as friend. That illusion is what let me open up to him. When my friends were hurting, my instinct was to take care of them. Your pattern is to push your own pain aside and focus instead on what you think the people around you need, Dr. B said. Even after our 1.5 years of work, it was unsettling that he had pegged me so well. He paused, and I listened to the drone of passing cars traveling up and down Amherst Street. The murmur of voices floated through the wall from the office next door. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, he said, and paused again before asking gently, but if you're doing all the caretaking, then who takes care of you? A fresh collection of tears filled my eyes. I want you to know that I'm so grateful for your compassion, Melanie, he said, and bent forward, resting his elbows on his knees. But I want you to listen to me, to really hear me. His look was pointed, his voice serious. You don't have to take care of me. He slowed his speech on this last sentence, giving each word equal emphasis. You don't have to protect me from your pain because you think it might make me sad. My story is not your story. Your story is unique, and I want you to talk about it. You need to talk about it. I'm here to listen. I felt like I should launch a protest, but the clamor of emotions inside me wanted to cling to what he was saying and find calm. There will be times when our stories intersect, and I'll be feeling some of what you're feeling. That's only natural, Dr. B said. There's some comfort in those intersections, don't you think? Yes, I whispered, and looked over his shoulder out the window where the tall pines across the street swayed to the rhythm of the wind. This is me giving you permission to talk about your pain, about your sadness. I'm telling you, it's okay. There was that carte blanche invitation again, its sincerity almost painful. My guarded memories, fully formed scenes of a beloved life now disappeared, tugged against their restraints. The roadblock started to crumble. My tension released. Dr. B leaned in and said, so tell me more about your father.
I'm so struck that that part of the chapter, it's like a blueprint for the whole book. It's like a primer for the book. It's her fortresses start to crumble. And when they do in therapy, then she can write the story on the page. And until then, she has this very fortress heart, right? And she has this hard silence. And she's not going to give in. I have a couple of questions for you actually, Melanie, around it, which is, it took you a while to get there with him, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we kind of spent the first year, like, kind of talking around things like I would bring up like I initially started therapy not for this at all. I had kind of another situation going on in my life that I thought like maybe it's good to talk to somebody about this. Like I was having some panic attacks, I was having some anxiety, and so I kind of started with that in mind, never thinking that this is what I was going to talk about in therapy, which is so ironic, like we like to deceive ourselves, don't we? And so I ended up taking like close to a year. And I think part of it was that I really needed to trust him. And it really took that long for me to feel like, when he's asking me to talk about things, like he really means it. When he says he's not going to judge anything I say, like he really means it. Like it took that long for me to get to it. I mean, like we had kind of skirted it, like he'd asked about family history like day one. And, are your parents still living is that initial question. And then it's like, oh, no, that's a complicated question, but I just never really talked about it.
It just is quite profound to me that a year went on.
Mhm.
And it shows, I know there are a lot of writers in this room and incredibly avid and intentional readers. And it shows how much intention went into this book, because first she had to get through that.
Mhm.
And it also brings up this idea of trusting the reader.
Right.
So first we have to trust the therapist, we also have to trust ourselves.
Right.
And I wanted to ask you about that. He says to you, you don't have to protect me from your pain because you think it might make me sad. I have had a number of students say to me, but if I tell my story so truthfully, won't it make the reader sad?
Right.
Well, I don't want to do that to the reader. Tell me how you had to work through that.
I had that same feeling, right? Like it's that same feeling like, well, and I think that was a lot of how I carried that story silently too, because of kind of the unique circumstances around my father's death. It was always kind of one of those stories you tell and like people would kind of like suck in breath and like not know what to say. And so I always felt like in those moments when I did share that story, I always felt like I had to like comfort the people I had just told, like, it's okay. It hasn't,
Right.
Like, I'm fine. I'm okay now. It's all right. And so I think I kind of had that, like, I was already in that place of like, every time I tell this story, I have to make other people feel better about it. Right.
Yeah.
And so I had to kind of work through that. And I think that scene was like part of it. Like, I don't have to make my reader feel better about my story. I mean, I have to take care of them in the way that I write the story, but I had to let go of my responsibility to like, because I think I always wanted to like, where's the upswing? Where's the hope in this? Like where all of these scenes need to end on some kind of like happy note. And so when I was finally able to kind of let go of that, I think that's when the real story kind of came to the surface too.
Okay, that's fascinating, because when we first met, and if you just think you're writing a story about your father's death from AIDS, right, and the secret, that's possibly going to write yourself into a corner.
Right.
There is no happy ending.
Right.
He's always going to die.
Yeah.
And like the car is always going to crash.
Right.
Right. So what's the real story? Right. So when did you start realizing that you couldn't and didn't have to protect your mother or your brothers?
I'm still working on it in some ways, because I kind of feel like I'm still doing that a little bit, like post-publication. But I think I came to a point where I recognized, like, as long as my intentions are to tell my piece of this story, right? In Writing Hard Stories, in my interview with Andre Debuse, he said, you don't have to tell the family story. You have to tell your story of being in that family. And that to me was like a really profound kind of thought, like, all right, I don't have to tell everybody else's experience. I don't have to try to imagine what everybody else was going through. And I felt like as long as I could kind of take the intention of, I'm telling my pieces of this story with all of the contextual detail necessary for me to be able to do that. So at times that meant revealing things about other members of my family, but none of it was with the intention of deep exposure for them.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, it doesn't, this book doesn't feel like some sort of confession.
No.
So you told me a couple weeks ago that you have never felt more yourself since having published this book. Like things feel very authentic.
Yeah,
for you.
there's kind of a new confidence in my own voice, and I think it's like the more I come out and I have conversations, it's not frightening for me. This is not frightening. This is like really wonderful for me to kind of sit here and look at you and know that you're listening to what I have to say. And also to recognize like that there's a connection that happens when I'm vulnerable and authentic. I think it opens up authenticity in the space, right? And I've been thinking about that a lot, because I've been thinking about, when you carry something silently for so long. And for me, it was, this very big secret that was impacting my entire world. It was this barrier you know, that kind of never made it possible for me to like lean in, or for other people to lean fully into me, right? And I feel like I've taken that barrier away, and there's great relief in that. You know, it's like, here I am. I'm not afraid to talk about this. I'm not afraid to say this is the story that shaped me, that has, you know, impacted so much of my thinking and so much of my identity. It doesn't scare me anymore. And I think that that's what that feeling of authenticity is. It doesn't feel like this thing I have to hide. And you know, I always, with every audience, I feel like it's important to say, you know, I didn't reveal my father's HIV. My parents actually wrote a book the year that my dad died, and wrote and published a book. And so his HIV status was known before he died. So I'm not, you know, kind of taking this family secret that went to his grave and putting it out in front of the world. So that, I mean, I think I had a conversation at another event where somebody asked, like, do you think if it had gone to his grave, like, would you have written this book? And my initial response was no, but I don't know. You know, it's hard to kind of know. But so it wasn't about revealing that. It was about revealing me in the context of that.
Right. So that comes full circle. What is the consequence of keeping a secret, right? So what is the consequence?
The consequence is never being able to be your real self, right? It's never being able to be fully authentic with people. It's people never really being able to know you, right? And you know, everybody in this room knows what it's like to carry some kind of pain in silence, right? Like, we all do it to some degree. You know, family secrets are not unique to my family. You know, our circumstances were unique, but silence and suffering is certainly not unique within particularly our culture, and American culture. And, you know, I think that I recognize that the more we stay silent on these things, the more suffering I think people are enduring, you know? And so for me, speaking alleviated that suffering, and writing alleviated that suffering.
Yeah. I'm thinking about the profound kind of evolution of this woman who literally isn't almost able to answer the question, how are you?
Right.
Literally, to you know, a woman who is like so comfortable up here talking about her secret, the silence, right? It's quite extraordinary. And I have to imagine that some of that is attributed to the iterative, like, deepening of the drafts of this book.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, every time you write, you go a little bit deeper, right? And, you know, like, some of the scenes, it took me a really long time to get to. Another Susan story. You know, when we were working, you know, she talking about that timeline, she said, you know, at some point you're going to have to hit those dying points, you know, and she's like, at some point you're going to have to get there. And I was like, yeah, okay, whatever, you know. And that was the year her book Paris Was the Place was published. And it's a novel, but a character in the novel dies of AIDS. And I remember I was walking my dog on this like isolated wooded path, listening to Paris Was the Place and listening to this dying scene of this character. And I remember just kind of stopping in the middle of this path and being like, oh shit, that's what she meant, you know, when I was really going to have to look at this, right? And it was just kind of this realization. But even then, I mean, it took me, you know, another full year before I could even try writing those scenes of my dad dying. So it's, you know, like I recognized I had to do it, but at the time I was not ready, and I had to come to a place where I was ready to do it.
It's so important. It's so intense for people to hear that. And it's really kind of extraordinary to me. I mean, I guess it's because that is the place I live. It's like the long view of a book structure and its life. I have to say, I was working with a dear man who I've known for a number of years on an extraordinary book he's writing in Portland, Oregon, about a lung transplant that he had that completely changed his life. And he's got some good framing structures and such. This is just last week. And but I know he, metaphorically, I know what he has to do. He's got to write these really, really hard scenes actually of his childhood, because guess what? The book isn't really about his lung transplant. I know that's shocking. But he's profoundly changed by the lung transplant, which finally blew everything open, and he walked away from his life, and he was finally able to look back over his shoulder. So we're on the Zoom, just like on our phone call. And I said, so he was like, why do you think I was in denial? So much denial about being sick. And I was like, and then I was like, so I think at some point we're gonna have to go back to your childhood. Sorry to say that. I was like, we could do it really short, could be really short. And by the time we were done talking, like all these lights had gone on and all these avenues were so apparent to him of these deeply, deeply shaping, deeply imprinted moments where he got this idea of who he was that informed everything. And they were, his conception of who he was absolutely at odds with the person he became after the transplant. He could no longer wear the old costumes of the traumatized son. That was all done, but he had forgotten. And then I have to say, by the end of the call, he was super excited. He was ready. He was energized, but it takes sometimes someone being like, yeah, I think you're going to have to.
Hey, Melanie, if your dad dies, you have to actually write about it.
Yeah. And here we are, page 100. Tell me more about your father. And this is a 300-page book. So let's hear a little bit more.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go. Let's just do a little bit of the writing sort of stuff where let's do page 189. And
I love it. I love having somebody else decide what I'm gonna write. It's the best.
You're just on the ride.
It's like, okay,
yeah.
what page is that?
Yeah. We're just gonna pick up actually we're gonna go to the top. Yeah, exactly. 190. Let's actually go to I stared out the window.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I've just told this, it's another therapy scene, and I've just recounted this conversation that I had with my mom, and I've just come to the end of this conversation with my mother, where I'm trying it's right before Christmas, right before my dad died on December 13th. And so it was right before kind of the anniversary, and I had really wanted her to talk to me about it, but she entered and then walked away. And so this is just the end of that scene. I stared out the window. The blue of the sky seemed deeper, darker. Shapeless clouds drifted over its surface. My neighbor's truck was gone, and the street was now quiet. A fat squirrel sat motionless on a bare branch of the dogwood tree near the driveway. Longing stabbed my chest. I rested my hand over the spot beneath my collarbone, an attempt to stifle the ache that pressed out from the inside. I didn't want to pick up my laptop and go back to grading the rest of my portfolios. My momentum waned. My earlier enthusiasm zapped. I felt sluggish. I like a deflated balloon. I leaned my head back against the chair and closed my eyes. I did the same thing now as I finished telling Dr. B about the phone call. I didn't open my eyes when I whispered, I miss my dad. Dr. B allowed the assertion to settle in with us. Of course you do, he eventually said. There are so many reminders at this time of year, especially. I opened my eyes and sat straighter. Every year, as Death Day approaches, I tell myself it's just a day like any other day. And I try to pretend it's no big deal. But every year, when it arrives, it flattens me. Maybe you shouldn't work so hard to normalize it, Dr. B mused. Maybe that's part of the problem. It's not just a day. It's the anniversary of one of the hardest, most painful days of your life. You don't have to turn away from the difficult reality of what happened just because your mother does. I think you need to mark the day with intentionality, and I think you need to dwell in it for a while. I thought of those dreary winter weeks after Dad died, when I'd sat in my classroom, unable to move, unable to breathe, and Mom taught me to disconnect from the sorrow, cordon it off.
I might have learned too well. Dr. B's words gave me an alternative lesson. For all these years, I turned away from my grief, never allowing myself to be entirely in it. I needed to go closer, to honor that melancholic cloud that descended as the holiday season approached, and to also honor the reason it was there. I need to give myself permission to dwell, I said, trying on Dr. B's suggestion. He pressed his palms together. You need to give yourself permission to dwell.
I love that echo at the end.
Mm-hmm.
I'm struck too, everyone, by this sense of this outer story, right? The window and the blue of the sky and the clouds, and then this inner story, longing stab my chest. And the book keeps doing that so beautifully, sort of outer, inner, outer, inner. Was there a moment for us that you can talk about, and for yourself too? And then I do look forward to having a larger conversation so we can open it up and see what's coming up for people. But how did you find yourself grounding in the voice of this book? When did you start to feel like, oh, that might be the voice?
I think it probably was when I got into the like dwelling, right? Like I even think like earlier drafts of the book that like there were times when I had like earlier pieces melded with later pieces and I could hear the dissonance, right? Like that there was like they weren't matching, and I had to go back to those scenes and say, you know, what is it that I'm not really looking at, you know? And so I think when I started telling myself, first of all, like you have to, you know, I think about it, it was Baron Wormser, I think, who said, dwell, linger, stay, like that's his, you know, his expression that he used. And I've heard you echo it. I've heard other people echo that, but it's that idea, like when you think you're going to step out of a scene, stay longer, right? And that's the hardest thing to do. And there were scenes I had written that I thought were written, but then I had to kind of go back and dwell there just a little bit longer. And I realized like there was more to say. And so I think when I was able to really sit in the emotions of those scenes and be honest about what the emotions were in those moments, I think that's when the voice kind of came.
It makes a lot of sense to me. You can feel that organically. I needed to go closer. And that's what the book really starts to do. And I wanted to point out I want to just make a distinction between, there's the profundity of arriving at an emotion in story and thinking, I got it. I actually touched the trauma, or I touched the sadness. And what Melanie's suggesting, I think, and what I'm suggesting is that's not enough.
Right.
It's not enough to just touch it and think that it's going to have like this magical fairy dust and like be sprinkled over the whole book. Then you actually have to hang out in there and actually build on it and build around it. It doesn't mean you have to like bleed out or something, but you do have to contextualize it and ground it and look at it from different vantages, right? So I think first there's just the relief of having touched it.
Right.
Like I got close to the grief, I named it. And then maybe in 6 months in another draft, you go in closer and deeper. I had the experience of talking to someone who's writing a harrowing and incredible novel right now. And it's going to be amazing. It's a like lesbian, true Western murder mystery. Right? It's really, really good. And I'm working on it with her, and I was like, but you don't talk about her feelings very much. Like I'm riveted by the plot. I'm riveted, and she basically said, and I'm offering this to everyone to help you if you're feeling this ever. She's like, yeah, I'm gonna get to that later. She's like, I just needed to get this down and feel like I could touch it and like I knew my way around it. And I know I got to go back in, and I was really relieved to hear that. And in a way, that has been your process.
Well, it has, and you know, there's a scene actually that comes not long after that where I actually do kind of start going into these moments near my dad's death. Like one of them was, and I use this sometimes with students. Like I have the earlier version of it, and I have what it became. You know, and so it's a scene. So I surprised my dad. So Canadian Thanksgiving is different than American Thanksgiving. And so I had a holiday at work and I decided to fly home. So it was 5 weeks before my dad died. And I decided to fly home and surprise my dad for a few days over American Thanksgiving. And it was kind of the last really meaningful time we had together, because the next time I came home, he was actively dying. And so I had this beautiful memory of like sitting on the couch with him and him wanting to order Christmas presents for my mom. And it was long before internet shopping. So it was like calling LL Bean on the phone, you know, and going through the catalogs. And one of the things he did was he was wearing these socks and, you know, he's sitting there and like wiggling his feet. He was like, find these socks. And, you know, I did. There were these ragwool socks from LL Bean, and he had me order like a dozen pairs of them. And at one point I said, you know, why am I ordering? Who are these for? And he was like, everybody. And he kind of said, I think everybody could use some cozy socks this Christmas. And when I had written it before, I ended there. I ended at this like, oh, isn't that heartwarming and sweet that, you know, and that's where the scene ended. And what I have done in the ongoing scene, the new scene, is I stayed beyond that statement and what it actually really meant, and what I understood that it meant, and how I felt about it, you know, and that was a big transition. And that took that scene from being like this sweet little, you know, anecdote to this very, you know, kind of poignant moment of like desperation for him to stay, understanding that he wasn't going to, and just, you know, and yet here he was still trying to like look after us, you know, but that, like, I wouldn't have done that had I not sat in that scene longer, like put myself back there and said like, okay, you did that for the readers. Like you did that like little upswing at the end, and, you know, because what I did is I ended there and then I jumped ahead to Christmas morning of us all laughing and opening these socks, right after he had died. And so I left out what the real feeling was about that. So
that's amazing.
Yeah.
That's like a tutorial,
right,
in going back.
yeah,
And I remember because the sock scene was in from the very beginning,
right.
and I was always like, yeah, that's a nice scene.
Mhm.
That's fine. It's fine. I mean, it's sweet.
Yeah,
And I was looking, I mean, for
Right.
more, but you can't even say what you're looking for sometimes as a mentor too.
Right.
You just know it's got to get messier.
right.
And actually that's when it moves from one-dimensional to what I call three-dimensional.
Yeah.
It just got really three-dimensional.
And I think that was one of those examples of like, I thought I was taking care of my reader.
Yeah.
Right. Like I'm going to give them a
Totally.
sweet anecdote, and I'm going to take them to the happy moment of opening these socks, you know, and us laughing at all these socks, you know, and I like, rather than like what it really felt like to be making those phone calls for Christmas gifts that he was not going to be there to give. Right.
Yeah, that's really powerful.
Yeah.
And trusting your reader. She trusted her reader. She trusted us. We could handle it.
Right.
We could handle it. So we have readers here. We have
Yes.
listeners here. I know they can handle a lot. And we can go anywhere with you.
Yeah,
I know it's hard
absolutely.
to switch from like listening to talking, but please, I know Melanie's eager to answer questions or just if you want to share thoughts. Or we have a few minutes here at the end. Yes, Ruthie.
So, I'm partly into the book.
Yeah.
And love it.
Thank you.
And is it fair to say that it is a memoir in essays?
I wouldn't say because, I mean,
Yes and no?
yes and no. I think about it more, I've referred to it more as kind of a mosaic,
Okay.
that it's these kind of disparate pieces.
Yeah,
And not, like, I don't know that all of them could fully stand alone, but they're pieces that, when put together, tell a bigger story. That's kind of how I think about it, that it's, you know.
well, the reason I'm referring to it as essays is that reading it, I've had the satisfaction of feeling like I was moving through the labyrinth and I didn't know where I was going.
Right.
And by the end, there was a really tight conclusion.
Yeah.
So, you know, essays are of that help. But
Right.
the other thing I think you didn't think you needed to is that your family was evangelical.
Right. Yeah, we haven't really talked about
Yeah, we
that
didn't do
piece.
that.
Yeah.
That is a big piece of this.
Yeah.
I am the atheist, so feeding that layer
Yeah,
when it comes in is so profound.
right. Well, and that, you know, the faith journey is a big piece of the story because, you know, we were deeply invested in our Christian faith community. You know, I mean, at 13, I'm invested because my parents are invested, you know, but it was kind of our biggest social circle, our biggest community investment. And, you know, and then this thing happens, and it's those same voices that are claiming, you know, God's punishment and, you know, being accusatory about this disease, and also kind of a shattering of things I took for granted that, you know, like if I was a good girl, if I did all the right things, I'd be okay and things would be okay. And, you know, and so I had kind of that happening throughout, but then in going back and revisiting, it became kind of a faith crisis for me as well, because I really had to interrogate, you know, the roots of that stigma and the roots of our isolation. And, you know, that's an ongoing, that goes beyond the pages of this book, you know, but it's been kind of a reckoning for me of trying to understand how does that faith heritage fit into this story, but also what pieces of it do I hold on to in my own life too. So, yeah. Yes, Michelle.
I'm wondering if in the course of writing it, did you come to different perspectives about your dad's experience himself and your relationship to that?
I did. You know, I think when I first started writing, my dad felt very much like anything that was potentially critical or maybe revealed sides of him that weren't as, you know, kind of glowing, felt off limits to me. And I think that, you know, I think that's kind of what we do with the dead. So, you know, like we kind of put them on this pedestal and we want to keep them there. And I think I came to a place where I realized like I had to portray my dad as honestly as I could, you know, because I feel like he needed to be a real person for my readers too, you know, and they needed to see his flaws. They needed to see his, you know, huge qualities, and I needed to be able to reveal both. And that took a long time for me to be able to do it. And one of the things was because I felt like, you know, because I had to kind of talk about like, you know, it was his decision that made us all have to kind of follow suit, right? Like he made the choice for all of us. And, you know, none of us had a say in that choice. And I think to question that in the past always felt like blame, like I'm placing blame. And I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to place blame, but I think I was able to kind of come to a place where the scales balanced a little bit better for me, where I could say, you know, I'm not blaming him. I understand that decision. I recognize his reasoning, but it also was damaging and harmful, right? Like to be able to hold those two truths together never felt like something I could do. And it took a long time for me to come to that place. Yeah. Yes.
Growing up with your brothers, did you all talk about it?
No,
Anyone?
no. And part of that was, so my youngest brother was 8 at the time that my,
But everybody knew it was a secret.
well, that was the thing. So my youngest brother was 8 at the time that my dad was infected. I was 13. My 2 older brothers were 15 and 16. When my dad found out about his infection, he sat down with my 2 older brothers and told them. He didn't tell me, and he didn't tell my younger brother. But within days of that, I had somehow found out, and I don't know how I did, but very early on, I knew. And then eventually it was clear to them that I knew. But my younger brother, they didn't tell him until he was 15. So for 7 of those 10 years, we had to keep the secret from him too. She was, yeah. I mean, it was an impossible scenario. And so, you know,
not only could we not really talk about it outside of our family, but we couldn't talk about it within the family either. Yeah. So no, we didn't. We were all kind of leading these parallel experiences, but they never merged.
How does your family feel about it?
No, I shouldn't make that. I shouldn't make that face. They've been very supportive in terms of the writing and my writing process and my need to write it. I think anytime you're writing an experience that other people have shared pieces of, it's hard to see that experience through somebody else's lens. And I think that that's been the challenge for my mom, for my three brothers, is just to recognize, you know, that I have a different perspective on things they experienced, and to not know, you know, whether they're in full agreement of my perspective, right? And I mean, I think that happens, you know, think about like if you sit down at a family dinner and start telling a story, everybody else wants to add their take on the story. And this was an experience that they didn't get to do that, you know, they didn't get to put their 2 cents on this story. So I'm sure for them, that's a difficult part of it, you know, and I think for a very long time, you know, the book my parents had written was the official story, you know, and so they've attached to that version of the events, they've attached their own version of the events. And so this is a new version for them to kind of digest. And, you know, that I recognize that that's not easy. You know, I think my mom is very afraid that people are going to see her as neglectful in some way, when she was not at all. It wasn't neglect in any way, shape, or form. She was a wonderful mother. And I know if I had gone to her, if I had gone to my dad and said, I'm struggling, I'm having a hard time, they would certainly have welcomed me to ask questions, but I just didn't do that. So I say to her, like, you couldn't know what you didn't know, you know, and I was really good at playing the role of the cheerful daughter. I mean, that was my job. I was the only girl. That was my role. And so, you know, I've said to my mom, I think, you know, I think people are going to respond exactly how you responded. Like, it must have been overwhelming for her. And it was. I mean, not only was she trying to help us kind of live a normal life, but she was carrying the burden of everything my dad was experiencing, you know, so yeah. Judy.
Did you allow folks who are in the brothers, doctors, to read it before, like long before publication? Did you ask opinion?
So,
and wait, let me
oh, go ahead. Yeah, go.
If one of them were to have said, like, yeah, no, that's not how that works. I don't want that in there. You are, I know this, like, still allowed to move forward with it, but right.
So I made a very distinct point of not asking for their input as I was writing. They knew I was writing something. They knew I was writing something in connection to this story, but it felt really important for me to write this without their input. And part of that is just because I call my brothers titans in my story. You know, they're all very, you know, type A personalities, very strong personalities. And I know my tendency to kind of bend to their perspectives, right? And not in a bad way, but I tend to be more of a follower. And it was important for me to really make this like my memory of things without anybody else's memories. Same with my mom. I didn't want her memories kind of clouding it. And then I made the decision that until I knew it was going to be published, I wasn't going to show it to any of them. Just more because, not because I was hiding anything, but more, you know, there's some really hard scenes in this that they lived through too, that I'm sure were very difficult for them to revisit, you know? And so I didn't want them to have to do that unless it was going to be made public. And so then I did let them read it. And, you know, my 2 older brothers kind of read it too late to have any input. You know, they read it like after I'd submitted.
Which was
like,
them.
Yeah.
They knew the deadline.
Right, exactly.
Sorry.
And, you know, they waited, you know, so there wasn't anything that I could have done. And, you know, my mom had one little part that she asked me to change, but, you know, and a part like I would never have guessed that would be the thing she would hyper focus on, and I did, because it wasn't like something I needed to live or die on. And, but overall, I think I had kind of committed that I wasn't going to make any big changes. Like it was the version that it was, right? And then with my therapist, you know, because I do write about him a lot, but he heard all of this in process. Like he was really basically my first reader for most of this book. So, and he, you know, he was comfortable with what I had shared about him. So, yeah.
I think it's such a great thing for everyone to hear, because I think some of us truly think that we may actually die if we write the story true. Like we actually think something will befall us.
Yeah.
Like the skies will open and
I felt like that for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, Mark Doty, the great poet who I love so much, said he wrote a memoir about his father actually, and he said he felt to not write it was to lie.
Right.
Like he was living a lie by not writing it.
Yeah.
So he had to write it.
It's a great essay to read. It's called Return to Sender that he wrote. If you ever want an essay about that, because he still carries very conflicted emotions. And, you know, like it's hard, even if your intentions are good, you can never predict what somebody's reaction is going to be to what you've written. And I think I'm kind of coming to a place of trying to realize, like, I just have to let that be. I have to let it be what it is, you know, no matter who reads it and what their responses are.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
so.
All right, we probably have time for one last question if there's one. I don't know if there is. If not, we will start to close out. Okay. So wow, we covered some ground.
Yeah.
I feel like we got a primer on how to write a hard memoir. I also am so struck by the title, A Hard Silence, in that sometimes all anyone needs to hear is like, oh, that sounds hard.
Right. Yeah.
That actually sounds hard.
Right.
And I'm really glad that you name it.
Yeah.
It was a really hard silence.
And I took that title. Kim Stafford has a book called 100 Tricks Every Boy Can Do, How My Brother Disappeared, about his brother's death by suicide. And there was a line in the book where he talked about the hard silences in his family. And I went to him when I read that and I said, could I take that line?
Oh,
Could
so
I
cool.
use, yeah. And he was, he said, if you mind something from my story, great, and so, yeah, so it came, it rang so true to the experience that it was like, that's what I want the title to be.
Oh, that's very cool. And it's a great place for us to end on. So I want to thank you for being so honest and generous with us for this triumph of a book.
Thank you.
So let's give us
thank you for such a beautiful, intuitive read of it, and just
wow.
I love seeing
Yeah.
all these scribbles on the pages.
More
I mean, there's something so meaningful when your mentor has done that, she's gone through and
It's very, very
circled and
exciting.
taken notes.
Yay. Okay, so now everyone has to buy lots of these books for their gifts for people. Because yes, it's a hard silence, but it's a beautiful story too. And it's a love story. It's a beautiful love story. So I know Terry is over there and I know you're gonna sign. So
Yeah, I'll just sit right
hang
here.
out
I'm just gonna hang out right here.
Cool.
So
Perfect.
thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.